Ready.
Hello, I'm Diane Castle. I work at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf at the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. I'm an audiologist, and I teach telephone training for the deaf and oral interpreting. Today, I have a friend with me, Kirsten Gonzalez. Kirsten is a specialist for the hearing impaired at Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, California. Kirsten's job is counseling and service coordination for hearing impaired students. She's also a member of the Oral Deaf Adult section of the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf. We're very pleased you could be with us today, Kirsten. I'd like to ask you some questions. First, I'd like to find out a little bit about your background. Can you tell us about the history of your deafness, how much of the hearing loss you have, and if you have any residual hearing?
It's nice to be here, Diane. I am profoundly deaf at this time. I have approximately a 110 decibel loss in both ears, but I wasn't born deaf. As far as we know, I was born with normal hearing. And when I was about 6, I had a very severe case of the measles. Immediately after that, my parents noticed that I was asking for a lot of repetition, so they took me to several specialists. The final conclusion was that I had a nerve loss in both ears caused by the measles, by the high fever. Then my hearing went down gradually until by the time I was about 11, I was profoundly deaf. At that time, I could no longer use the telephone because I couldn't understand voices well enough without watching someone. Apparently, in the course of that time, I picked up lip reading, generally without even realizing it. I think I was just imagining sound and lip reading, actually, when I saw people talk. I didn't get a hearing aid until I was 21 in my senior year in college. Maybe because my hearing loss was so profound that there wasn't anything that could help it at that time. But by the time I was 21, I had more powerful aids, and that's when I started wearing one. So all through high school and college, I did not hear voices at all.
Can you tell us a little bit about your education, how you went through school with a hearing loss?
Well, I went to natural, normal public schools all my life. I didn't have any special classes or even speech therapy. And I went through high school and college by copying the notes of classmates. I would look around for someone who seemed to take a lot of notes. And then I would approach that person and explain that I didn't hear and that I couldn't get most of the lecture because of the various problems of lip reading a teacher in the classroom. And then ask that person Margaret if I sat beside him or her and copied his notes. And most of the time, people were very good about it. Sometimes they were a little taken back, but usually we became friends.
Well, we're here talking about oral interpreting today, and I'm interested in when was the first time that you used an oral interpreter?
Actually, it wasn't until I was in graduate school that I had even heard about oral interpreting. At that time, I was in a seminar class, and I was no longer content to miss some of the things that were happening in the classroom or not be a participant. So I asked the disabled center of that college for an oral interpreter. But the whole thing was so new at the time that they weren't really sure what I meant. And I was standing sign language interpreter. and knew nothing about oral interpreting, and was also uncomfortable and that he also used sign language.
Well, now, why is it difficult for a speech reader like yourself to not be able to use a sign language interpreter? I mean, you could watch their mouth.
Well, even if the speaker has very clear speech, or rather the oral interpreter, in all my experience, and I have more experience now with both sign language and oral interpreters, several things happen when you provide a sign language interpreter who speaks clearly for a speech reader. And one of the things to remember is that there is no reason to assume a speech reader knows sign language at all, so that the movements of the hands have no meaning whatsoever. If you see a sign like this, you have no way of knowing that means experience. It's just some movement up by the face. And all of this hand movement can be very distracting when you're concentrating on the face and on the movements of the mouth. And you actually have to use some energy to not pay attention to this movement, which is taking away from the energy you need to devote to the breathing. So that is a distraction. Another thing that happens is that many of the signs are made around the face, and that will block one source of information for the speech reader. That might be a very momentary blocking off, but it happens frequently. And even though it may not prevent the speech reader from getting information, it also becomes tiring and creates more fatigue. But in addition to that, almost every sign language interpreter I've seen who is a good sign language interpreter does not also speak clearly and say the words distinctly and say all the words as an oral interpreter must do. There will be words dropped out because they're not signed, or there will be words that are said only partially. The most obvious sound as in for photography and not the rest of the word. And the rhythm changes because the spoken part of interpreting tends to follow the rhythm of sign language, which is not usually the same as natural speech rhythm. And the speech reader is used to natural speech rhythm. So all of these factors intrude upon and make it more difficult for speech readers.
Well, that's very interesting and very clearly explained, I think. Many people perhaps would like to know what is an oral interpreter. Could you give us a brief definition?
I would say what an oral interpreter does is to silently repeat what a speaker says. That is the most simple definition. Usually verbatim, depending on the consumer. And that interpreter, however, must be trained to articulate so clearly that a speech reader or speech readers at various skill levels have very little problem understanding everything that person says.
Now, we've heard that perhaps only 30% can be read on the lips. How can possibly speech read information or a lecture when only 30% can be understood? How do you explain that?
That's one of my favorite questions. That is stated that way, it is really a mess that's caused a lot of problems in this field. I understand a study was made in which it was found that approximately 30% of the isolated speech sounds of the English language are visible on the lips. And with that statement, I have no argument. But apparently, that has been turned around to be stated that only about 30% of what people say can be understood by a speech reader, which is entirely different thing. Because speech readers are not lip reading or speech reading just isolated speech sounds. They are lip reading combinations that form words and phrases and sentences. And all those things put together are what give the meaning. So what you're doing is understanding the meaning of what is said, which is different from actually seeing every single sound. like Dr. Joseph Rosenstein, who was one of the best oral interpreters I've ever seen, said in one of his lectures, when you walk up to someone with a smile on your face and your hand outstretched, you don't say, but. You say, how are you? How do you do? I'm glad to meet you. Or something like that. And the speech leader is using so many other clues besides what they see on the mouth, that they know that in that situation, this is probably the kind of thing that's going to be said, not one isolated finding.
That's a very vivid explanation. I'm sure that we'll remember that for a long time. Now, I know, Kirsten, that you have been the chairman of the Oral Interpreting Committee at the Alexander Graham